Absolutely. I now welcome the representatives for 4-year terms Australia to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Marty Gray. I am the founder of 4-Year Terms Australia, which is an advocacy group focused on achieving fixed 4-year terms for our federal parliament.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussion.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to start by saying that Australia has one of the shortest parliamentary terms in the democratic world. We're one of only 8 countries which has a term of 3 years or less, and the Prime Minister of the day also has complete discretion to call an election earlier than this. In practice, this means Australia faces an electoral campaign on average every 2 years and 8 months. I've got longer to pay off my phone plan at the moment than that. It is this combination of really short maximum terms of 3 years and an unfixed election date, which means our federal government actually has very little time to govern compared to most other governments around the world, as also our states. It means Australia's economic growth also consistently drops in election years as businesses and the public service have to delay decisions and investments every 2.5 years waiting for polls to be called. These limitations around our parliamentary terms have been debated and known about for over 100 years, but they're getting more acute in the modern era. The complexity of the federal government and the issues that it's facing are only increasing, which means our short terms are often ill-equipped to deal with some of the biggest challenges of today. The 24-hour news cycle and professional campaigning means strategising and commentary around when the election is going to be held are a far greater distraction than they've ever been in the past. And now every state, territory and local government now operate on 4-year terms, and all except Tasmania have fixed terms. Our federal government is an outlier, resulting in inconsistencies and misalignment with our other levels of government. This all has a really significant but often hidden cost on our economy. Estimated that if we switch to 4-year fixed parliamentary terms for our federal government, we would save around $60 billion over the next 20 years. And this committee, I think, can be the start of that change. The first priority should be to determine what an appropriate model and secure the necessary multi-partisan support to deliver a fixed election date via legislation as a first instance, with appropriate guardrails. This would lay a really strong foundation for a subsequent referendum on fixed terms, and then ultimately perhaps one on 4-year terms as well. I know many balk, and rightly so, at the prospect of a referendum. There are really 2 strong reasons why we should think about one when it relates to parliamentary terms. The first of which is there's political support right across the political spectrum that just doesn't exist for a lot of other issues. If you put John Howard, Kim Beazley and Bob Hawke, Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton, Julia Gillard and Malcolm Turnbull, state premiers like Anastasia Palaszczuk, Dominic Perrottet, Senator David Pocock, as well as interest groups like Grattan Institute, the Business Council and the Australia Institute in one room, and tried to get them to agree on something significant about how the country should be run, there's probably not many things that they would agree on. But they can all agree and have recognised that our current parliamentary term is holding us back, and we really should take advantage of that. But despite this political support right across the spectrum, the reason why we haven't got movement is there's been this belief that the public isn't willing to accept change, that the issue is too boring or too self-interested for politicians to pass a referendum. I think this concern is overstated, and we should give the public far more credit. When asked, the majority of Australians consistently support longer terms and an election date that is set more independently than it currently is. We had a New South Wales and a Queensland referendum pass when they moved to 4-year fixed terms. And it's also an issue where political leadership is actually required to start that debate, though. Term lengths are an invisible cost, and it won't be a priority until our political leaders make it one. And New Zealand's experience shows this. A parliamentary inquiry very similar to this one we have today in 2023 recommended that they move from 3 to 4-year terms. And that led to legislation that is now before the New Zealand Parliament, subject to a referendum. And this committee, I hope, can play a very similar role to that one in New Zealand. Australia's short parliamentary terms are a historical relic designed to align with colonial parliamentary terms that no longer exist, and we should take this opportunity to fix them for good. Thank you.
Thanks, Marty. You've outlined some of the reasons, but sort of what was the catalyst for you starting this 4-year terms Australia?
It happened to me during the last federal election, which I just read in the paper that Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese both agreed that they think we should move to fixed 4-year terms, probably after being asked for the 1,000th time that day when the election was going to be held. And that said to me, here's two leaders who agree on nothing during the lead up to an election campaign, but they agree on one of the most fundamental things about how our constitution, how our parliament should run. I looked in further detail and just saw that this had been an issue for so long with so much political agreement on, but the problem was that there was this lack of understanding or willingness to engage the public on the issue because, it is a little bit tricky, it is a little bit boring, there's always a higher priority. So there was a gap where I think there's a way that we can better communicate with the public about what the benefits of this change are. And doing some work in New Zealand, I recognised the fact that, they're currently going through this process. And when it got talked about a little bit more, the public really understood it. It's not rocket science. People can know the difference between 3 and 4. People really dislike the 6 months of talking about when the election's going to be held, which is a decision that has very little interest for the general public or impact on their daily lives. And then talking to more people, you just realise that there's just a lot of agreement and a lot of benefit here.
Define what you mean by fixed, because we've heard some evidence that sort of says you could legislate fixed term but still keep the provisions within the Constitution that allow for a double dissolution, that allow for the dissolution of Parliament. Is that the model that you're suggesting, or like the full wholesale rewrite of the Constitution where you remove those powers and it's like fixed? Or is it sort of fixed but can be dissolved?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Chair. So the model that I think works is, I guess, what you would call semi-fixed.
Yeah, okay.
So there's a spectrum, like what we have today, where the political leader of the day has complete discretion to call an election whenever they wish within that term length, which is what we have. The other end of the spectrum is entirely fixed, can't change. So the US House, for example, Norway is another example where the election date won't change basically under any circumstance. What the vast majority of countries and the vast majority of our states and territories do is have a version of semi-fixed. So you have a fixed election date, but there are provisions that enable an early election to be called in certain circumstances, essentially to break a deadlock in the parliament. So,
so the double dissolution stuff still there, still the government of the day would have the power to retain that. Yep.
Exactly.
Yep.
Or if there's a vote of no confidence in the government and confidence can't be regained in a certain period of time, or some other leader or party can't regain confidence in a certain period of time, there's still the ability to call an early election. And what that model does is it retains the flexibility to call early elections in circumstances that require it, but it removes the unfairness of the current model, which allows one political leader to basically set the date to their advantage, which obviously has an issue of fairness. But the bigger issue for Australia, I think, is it reduces our already very short terms, because our maximum term is 3 years, but we go down to 2.7 years because of these unfixed terms that are called early.
You referenced in your submission over $60 billion in benefits over 20 years. Could you sort of expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was a study done late last year by Mandala Partners on behalf of the McKinnon Foundation. So the benefits fall into 3 buckets. The first bucket is a better performing parliament, essentially. So at the moment, there's a very short window, you would all know far better than I do, where you can really focus on passing legislation, getting things done. All of the people are in their roles, they know what they're doing, but they're not yet campaigning. So if you can expand that window, at the moment, it's probably around 12 months in some circumstances under a 2.7-year term. But under a fixed 4-year term, you actually double the amount of time that the Parliament and the government is working, and its sole focus is on just getting stuff done. So there's a huge productivity boost there. The second category of benefits, which is actually the largest, it's around 40 billion, is a more productive public service and a more productive private sector. So the public service in the lead up, well before the election is called, has to pause a lot of big investments and decisions because it has to wait, doesn't know when the election's going to be, doesn't know who's going to win, so it pauses a huge amount of decisions. I've been a public servant in caretaker mode. I can say from personal experience, productivity is not at its highest. And the private...
Be careful what you're saying.
I'm just speaking about my own productivity, not anybody else's, I assure you. But it happens in the private sector all the time as well. So, you don't know when the election's going to be called. If there's big policy differences between parties, you don't even know who the minister's going to be. You don't know who's going to have the balance of the Senate. So what private companies do is they just delay big decisions. I spoke to somebody who works in the building and construction industry the other day who reached out to me after I started this campaign, and they say they regularly pause major bills waiting for an election campaign to be called. So, you're waiting 6-9 months extra for new houses to be built, one of the biggest issues our country's facing, because we have the world's shortest parliamentary terms and complete uncertainty when our elections are going to be held.
I'll go to Senator Hodgson-May.
Sorry, can you hear me better now?
Yes, we can.
Great. Sorry, just let me get it working. Thank you for joining us today. First question, you noted in your submission that every state and territory except for Tasmania has fixed terms. Expanding on your previous answer to the chair, in your view, how might introducing fixed terms at the federal level improve the functioning of our elections and strengthen democratic processes regardless of term lengths?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Senator. I think it will do so in two really important ways. The first way is it will increase the length of our extremely short terms already. So if you have a fixed election date, you reduce the basically ability of a prime minister, or increase the political cost of a prime minister calling an early election, so that we have more delivery time. So an unfixed term in a 5-year government like in Canada or the UK isn't as much of an issue because you're not reducing the amount of time that much. But when you already have the world's shortest maximum terms, if you reduce it by 3-4 months, that's 3-4 months of really productive government time. So that's why it's so important in Australia. The other reasons why it's important, I think, is it just increases enthusiasm for the democratic process. There is not a single person in Australia who thinks talking for 6 months about when the election's going to be held, betting on when the election's going to be held, endless commentary on the news about, the NRL grand finals this day, school holidays are this day, so we think it's going to be this day. It is extremely enduring for the general public. And if we can spend more time focusing on the actual issues that matter during an election rather than when the election's going to be held, it's a far better outcome. And in the States, that's something that's just a given. We don't have to have that conversation in the States because we know when the elections are going to be held, because they all have these semi-fixed terms where the election's going to be held on a certain date unless there's sort of extenuating circumstances. And we almost take it for granted because it's not something that we face.
Yeah, thank you. As someone who's been pregnant for 2 election cycles, I think it would be quite useful from an accessibility point of view too. You've also talked about potential economic benefits of 4-year terms. Have you undertaken, or are you aware of any analysis of the economic impacts of introducing fixed terms at a federal level?
It's a really good point. So the most recent research that's been done on this is focused on both together, basically fixed and 4-year terms. I think the general consensus is from a lot of experts who've worked on this for a long time is that the benefits of fixed terms are probably greater than moving to 4-year terms, predominantly because of that indecision and that risk and uncertainty that exists in both the public service and the private sector. If you can remove that alone will unlock a lot of the benefits. So if the benefits are $40 billion for fixed and 4-year terms for that uncertainty in the public service and the private sector, you say 60% of the benefits of that, you're looking at $24 billion over the next 2 decades.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And then moving back to 4-year terms, you make the case for increased government accountability via 4-year terms. Is there a counter-argument, I suppose, about that less frequent elections may reduce accountability by removing regular opportunities for voters to express dissatisfaction?
No, it's a really good point, Senator. And what I think moving to fixed and 4-year terms will do is it's not about making politicians' lives easier, it's about making them perform better, in my view. I think because at the moment, when you have an election every 2.7 years, it's a system that essentially forces politicians to be in this constant campaign mode. And you have a very limited window where your job is solely to just get things done to improve people's daily lives. So if you can move to 4-year fixed terms, what you can end up doing is you can hold politicians more accountable for what they deliver in their job rather than what they'll say they'll deliver on the campaign trail. And there's been evidence done in a lot of other jurisdictions that the effectiveness of parliaments actually increases when you do have a longer term. Obviously, it's a spectrum, like you don't want terms that are too long, but 4 years and definitely fixed terms seems to be the right balance, particularly in Australia, because Australians vote more than almost anyone else in the world. We have 3 levels of government. We have compulsory voting, unlike anywhere else in the world. Australians aren't putting their hand up saying, I want to vote more often. What they're saying is, I want my politicians focused on long-term delivery, improving my lives, rather than the short-termism that our current model essentially forces us all into.
Thank you very much. And I think my last question is, you've explored a few different options to align Senate terms to a 4-year lower house term. Do you have a preferred option, and are there any drawbacks, you think, to an 8-year Senate term?
Thank you, Senator. And that is definitely the most complicated problem in this whole debate. And it's why I think we should focus first on legislating fixed terms, potentially then going to referendum on fixed terms, because it's much simpler and easier to explain that, I think. But when it comes to 4-year terms, there's 2 really realistic options. One is to extend senators' terms to 8 years and continue to have a half Senate election every general election, or you reduce them to 4 years. And then you basically have a double dissolution every general election. There's pros and cons to both. The biggest negative to moving to 8-year terms for the Senate is that same one about accountability that you mentioned before, Senator. 8 years is a long time to not be held accountable at an election, so there's a concern that that is too long. It still exists under our current model of 6, but 8 obviously makes that longer. And the more recent concern that people have raised about that is about accountability in relation to how they're voted in. So if you're a senator voted in with a certain party, you leave within the first 6 months, you've got 7.5 years potentially as an independent or from another party. There's a question as to whether or not that is too long, because the overwhelming majority of Australians don't vote for an individual senator, they vote above the line. The concern about 4 years, restricting it to 4 years, is, the whole reason we had extended senator terms at a federation was this idea of continuity, that, you didn't want a full handover at a general election, particularly if a certain party won a really large proportion of the vote. There's a debate as to the merits of that in the modern era, as minor and independent party votes have consistently increased, not only in Australia, but in all democracies. So the chances of a government of the day gaining both power in the House and the Senate is increasingly not that likely. So whether or not that's an important checks or balance going forward is probably something that's debated a bit more. Myself personally, and I think most of the people who've worked on this, suggest that having equal 4-year terms for both the House and the Senate is probably the better option on balance. But I think also it's the one that's going to pass a referendum is probably the most important too, because it's more complicated than just talking about fixed terms, in my view.
Great. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Senator Mahon.
Okay. I just want to go to... Thank you very much for your submission. It was really interesting. We have previously heard from some other witnesses around the fact that for the last few federal elections, they've occurred around the same time. They roughly ended up in May, and they sort of run to a fairly standardised format. So it was interesting to hear in the submission, to read in the submission, that it's about 2 years and 8 months on average. So that's not necessarily sort of consistent with what we were hearing. So that's helpful advice. And it was also very interesting to read about the productivity piece. I just wanted to sort of tease out a little bit more. You talked about sort of a bit of a 2-step process about how we might be able to get to fixed terms. So in stepping that through from a legislative perspective, based on the advice and the research you've got available to you, do you think it would be fairly simple for a parliament to change the Electoral Act to move to add a fixed term for 3 years without needing to proceed to a referendum?
I think, and other countries have done this as well, it is definitely possible, and I think that should be the first step to revise the Act. And obviously that has to be a very multi-partisan approach, and if you can do it in a way where the Parliament can be as cohesive as possible around it. Obviously the concern that many have raised about this is the Constitution will override what legislation is passed, and a government of the day can repeal that legislation as well. So it's obviously not as rock solid as changing the Constitution. But I think it does 3 things that are really important. The first and foremost is you actually nail down what the model should look like. What are the guardrails? What are the exemptions? When would the date be? So if you actually go through the process collectively as a parliament to decide that, that's a lot of the problem solved. The second thing that I think it does is you normalise fixed elections for the general public. So if we can have an election or have two elections under a legislated fixed election date, then when you go to a referendum in future, you're not asking the Australian public to accept something new. You're just asking them to enshrine an existing process into the Constitution. So if we're all used to having an election in the first week of May, for example, and all we're asking the public to do is say, should we do this going forward, or should we just let the Prime Minister decide whenever they want? They go, hey, it's working pretty well. Why don't we keep doing this? So I think that's the two important points. And then I think the third point that's really important is a Prime Minister could, obviously, if they had the numbers, could repeal that legislation, or they could just go to the Governor-General and say, I know the legislation says this, but the Constitution says I can call it whenever I want, so I can do that. So they could do that, but it increases the political cost to any sitting Prime Minister of doing that. So if you're a Prime Minister today, setting an election whenever you want, there's no political cost in doing that. It's actually assumed that you will do that, and everyone just bakes that in. If all of a sudden you have to either repeal legislation or potentially contravene that legislation, you're going to go, hang on, the slight benefit I might get in having it 1 week over another is not worth that. So I'm going to just do when it's said it's done, and everybody can bake that in. And if you get that process in place and normalise it, as we have for our states, then I think it's a much easier sell to the Australian public.
Would you anticipate that first step of Electoral Act reform that puts in a fixed term on the 3-year term, that should be in place for the next federal election due in 3 years' time?
I mean, that would be a fantastic outcome, I think. I think fixed terms is easier to do that, and we've almost done it. Like, there was an example when, I can't remember which election it was, but Julia Gillard, when she was Prime Minister, she actually said the election's going to be held well in advance of it.
Yeah.
So, there's no... And you're not asking for extra time as a Prime Minister. The concern, what Queensland did in its referendum on moving to 4-year fixed terms, they said any 4-year term should go after the next election, because giving extra time obviously should happen after the next election. But if you're just fixing a term, I see no reason why you shouldn't do that within the current term, because I think the Australian public would actually be very supportive and very relieved that they don't have to endure another 6 months of, political Ouija boarding about when the election date's going to be, and businesses and the public service have confidence to know when it's going to be, to make the investments, to make the decisions that they need to. So I think we should do it in this term.
Absolutely. And because I'm a senator for Queensland and the world revolves around Queensland, I will say, allegedly, Chair, that I think taking people on a journey, we did that in Queensland. We did take the community on a journey, and that brought a lot of public support. I think people could see where we were going. If there was support to move to 3-year fixed terms, and we were to bake it in for the next federal election, that would be 2028. It is going to be a bit of a hairy year in Queensland, because we've got fixed 4-year terms for local government in March, the last weekend of March. We've got a fixed term, 4-year term for state election at the end of October. And then potentially, if we were to fix it in for the federal election, say around, May, we've got 3 elections. Obviously, there's a big country out there, so lots of different electoral cycles. So maybe that 2028 experience might provide some argument to pushing it out 1 year to 4, so you don't, the poor people of Queensland might be electioned out potentially in 2028.
The world does revolve a little around Queensland in this respect, absolutely, because you're a state that went to a referendum to move to 4-year fixed terms, so it was successful, so it shows it can be done. It created what I think is considered one of the best models for what the semi-fixed term looks like in terms of what the exemption should be. So it's a really great case study. And what you've just described, what 2028 looks like, is the exact problem that we have at the moment with 3-year unfixed terms, when our federal government is the outlier with state and local governments. You constantly have these overlappings that change every term that make it very difficult. And I can't imagine the amount of hours that are, unproductive in both the private sector and in the public services of those respective governments that are just spent trying to figure all of those things out. Like, imagine the different intergovernmental programs, the changing ministers, the changing priorities that happen as a result in that year. That's a huge cost to the Queensland economy.
Absolutely. I don't think I'm going to get any better evidence than the world revolves around Queensland, Mr. Chair, so I will leave it there.
Leave it at that before we get conflicting evidence. Mr. Burnell.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to go on from that. Isn't one of the issues that you have around fixed 3-year terms, though, that you're always going to have this clash with the state and local governments, whereby you do have a culmination of all 3 tiers of government having a vote in any 1 year? So look, it happened in South Australia in 2022.
And I think you're absolutely right. So that's one of the challenges with 3-year terms in general, having an inconsistency between federal government and everyone else. So that's one of the good arguments why we should move to 4-year terms. In respect to whether or not we should have unfixed or fixed terms, I think, as you've heard from our Queensland experience in 2028, that's a problem that we still face today. We faced in the last federal election as well, where the Western Australian state election was sort of conflicting as well. So it's not an issue that goes away if you move to fixed terms, but what it takes away from is the politics of the decision. All of a sudden, everyone outside of the parliament has more confidence in when that election's going to be held. Of course, there's still going to be conflicts, but you can work through a process that makes that a lot less uncertain for everybody else. Longer term, I think if you do move to 4-year terms, or if you do enshrine this in Constitution, there does need to be a process of, okay, now we've got this new system, how do we align state, local government and federal elections in a way that's as efficient as possible, where they're not overlapping with each other, and you maximise the amount of time that those respective governments can work together. Former New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet has talked about this a lot, about the fact that he found it incredibly difficult as a premier, because he'd have 3 to 6 months with his counterparts in other states where they actually neither of which were campaigning and neither of which were in the chair. And he said that made it incredibly difficult for him to actually negotiate with the federals, with the other state premiers. And if you move to fixed 4 years, eventually, I think you can really resolve that issue.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. So since Federation, we've had 45 referendums. We've only had 8 successful. That means we're running at an average of about 18% success rate. If referendums were easy, we'd probably have more of them. And you've made comments to the effect that there's general wide support for 4-year fixed terms. So what research has your organisation done to back up that statement?
It's a great point. So I think the first point I'll come to is, what are the ingredients that would make a referendum on this as successful as possible? And I think there's a couple of things that we can take account of. I should recognise the fact that there was a referendum on 4-year terms when Bob Hawke was Prime Minister in 1988, which failed. And there's a couple of really important lessons I think we should take from that process. First and foremost is it wasn't bipartisan at the time, so there was campaigning and votes fell quite similar on party lines. So my firm belief, similar to what happened in New Zealand, similar in some of the states, is that it has to be multi-partisan for this to go anywhere. The second thing was that referendum was bundled in with about 4 or 5 other questions as well. So there was recognising the local government in the Constitution. There was this quasi-Bill of Rights idea as well. There was too much information on too many different things. If you're going to do a referendum on term lengths, it's got to be just a single question and focused on that and that alone. And public education well in advance of the question is super important. This isn't an issue that's front of mind, but as soon as you ask people and talk to them about it, increasingly on support. In terms of what evidence there is for that, a bunch of different media companies, AFR did a recent poll that showed I think about 80% supported the change and 60% wanted a referendum within this term of government. There's a couple of universities who've done similar research on this, which I'm happy to provide the committee. And it's something that we've just started up, but we really want to do some more polling to show that there is a lot of support for this idea. And then some of the other things that I think are really important as well is actually how you stagger this. So sort of, as I said in the previous question, I think the right path forward would be to legislate, bed down a model for what fixed terms for 3 years looks like, get that in place, get the public accustomed to it, get talking about it. In the same way in New Zealand, once it starts being talked about, people get across it, they support it. And then we go to a referendum on saying, should we just keep the status quo of having a fixed election date rather than giving the power back to the Prime Minister to decide whenever they want? And consistently, I think the argument will be across the country that, yes, we support this. And the Queensland referendum succeeding, the New South Wales referendum succeeding in recent decades, I think shows that there is support for this.
No, thank you. Just lastly, with the rise of AI and the use of other social media influence style platforms, does that make it inherently more hard to keep a clear message around something like a referendum for 4-year fixed terms? And do you see any complications that we should be aware of, or have thoughts on how to deal with some of the mis and disinformation through social media platforms, including AI?
It's a really interesting point. I think the rise of social media, the 24-hour news cycle, and just the politics associated with that have really exacerbated the concerns with our current model. I think we've done pretty well as a country in spite of them, but because the media cycle is so fast now, and because the issues that we're dealing with are so much more complex, 2 years and 7 months is often really not long enough to actually spend the time doing that. And in this permanent campaigning mindset, it's a lot harder to just focus government on the job of getting the work done. So I think that is the biggest issue. I think, as you've sort of pointed out, public education will be incredibly important. I think this issue is actually a lot less complicated than people think it is. Should we have an independent election date rather than a political leader decide it? That's a question that most people support, and it's not the hardest question either. There's obviously a lot of detail on what the exemptions are that most people probably won't care about, but it is something that's actually not too bad. And to your point about AI, I think that's a great point as to why we actually need to do this. If you're the minister and you get directed by the Prime Minister, you need to legislate how we should regulate AI or disinformation at an election. You currently probably have a 9 to maybe 18-month window to pass that legislation, get it passed through the Senate. Our current model is just not equipped to deal with these issues, and we need more time to actually be able to deal with them if we're going to move forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Ms Campbell?
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming to share your views with the committee today. I too am from Queensland, so I'm glad that you are someone who also supports Queensland. I was going to go to your comments on the public consistently supporting longer terms, and you mentioned research on that, and I was wondering if you could please take us through the research.
Yeah, absolutely. So probably the most comprehensive thing to start off with is the 2 referendums or referenda that passed in New South Wales and Queensland, which is probably the most comprehensive example that we show that there is support for this. There's some research that's been done, it's just being finalised at the moment, that showed roughly about 75% of respondents said that they support fixed terms, and slightly less than that about 4-year terms. New Zealand at the moment is still tracking in the majority for its move from 3 to 4-year terms, although it's slightly more controversial there because they don't have an upper house, so there's concern it's giving too much power to the government of the day. And it's something that we're planning on doing in the near future, to do sort of a comprehensive national polling of just what the support is for fixed terms in particular, and then also one on 4-year terms as well. In terms of more information that's been done, a fair bit's been done in Europe as well, where there's been a couple of referenda or pieces of legislation that have passed there. And generally speaking, you're looking at around 2/3 of people in a lot of countries that are saying, I want an independent election date, one that has less political interference involved.
And what's been the public experience post the introduction of a fixed term?
I would say in most instances, and looking at what's happened in the States in particular, once it's in place, it no longer becomes an issue for the general public. The election's called when the election's going to be when it's going to be. We spend less time focusing on the indecision around when it's going to be, so the business and the public service have that productivity benefit. But for the public, the biggest benefit is you just don't have to spend 6 months hearing about when the election's going to be, and you can focus more on the issues that matter in election, or not focus on it at all. So I would say, particularly in relation to fixed terms, the general public's experience is just more of one of relief. Other countries that have moved from shorter terms to longer terms, the general experience has been, there's been reports from a couple of countries, and in the New Zealand inquiry in 2023 looks at this in detail, was that it's obviously very subjective, but there's been a reduced sense of short-termism with government. There's a roughly 20% increase in the amount of legislation or government programs that can be passed in non-election years. So you have an extra election year of that. You have 1 or 2 extra budgets within each election cycle. So your ability to do fiscal management within one term increases significantly. So the general experience is one where you have less short-term politics and more just long-term delivery.
And the economic benefits, have we seen them flow through in terms of the figures in the places where there has been a move to those fixed terms?
It's a good question. I'd have to come back to you on that. The studies that have generally looked at is that GDP growth drops on average 0.5% in an election year. Obviously, you still want elections, so that's an inevitability cost. That reduces by 1 year, and it reduces the uncertainty of, the study here in Australia looked at, which used a lot of data from Europe in particular, that showed that there's about a 2.4% increase in business investment when you have the increased confidence of a fixed longer term.
No. Thank you. That's all from me, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ms. Campbell. Can I just ask, in closing, just a few questions about the New Zealand, just your experience with New Zealand? If what I understand is that, so there was some public sentiment that sort of supported the move to fixed terms. Then the Parliament introduced legislation, and that's currently live now. Like, are they still debating that? Okay. And then if that draft legislation is passed, it would then require a referendum in future. Do you want to talk, is that sort of the timeline of what's happening down there?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Chair. So there was a parliamentary inquiry in 2023. Yeah. It was a report that looked at a range of things, but it effectively came to the conclusion that election parliamentary terms are a balance between accountability and effectiveness. You want a parliament to be accountable to the people fairly regularly, so it reflects the will of the people, but you also need to give them time to actually do the job. And it came to the conclusion that their current system of 3-year terms didn't have that balance right, that it wasn't performing as effectively as it could, and that could be increased substantially by moving to 4-year terms. So legislation was introduced this year and is going through the process now, probably to early next year. And the Prime Minister has indicated there that, subject to a referendum, they intend to pass that legislation and effectively move to 4-year terms. And I think one thing that's really interesting about the New Zealand process is I think the argument for 4-year terms in Australia is actually a fair bit stronger in New Zealand than in New Zealand for a couple of reasons. One is they don't have a Senate. So the biggest concern they have about moving to 4-year terms is that the government of the day will have a lot of power, whereas, we're one of the rare countries that have a democratically elected Senate, which holds the government to account every single day. And it's very rare, obviously, for an Australian government to hold the numbers in the Senate. So there's a level of accountability that exists here that doesn't necessarily happen in New Zealand or Canada and the UK and others. And that's why one of the biggest questions in New Zealand has been around that, like, are they going to change their committee processes to, give more power to the opposition and minor parties in response to longer terms? The other thing, they don't obviously have state or territory governments there as well. So the benefit of aligning state and territory governments with a federal term that exists in Australia doesn't really exist in New Zealand as well. And they also don't have a written constitution, which makes things a little bit easier, but it also, again, doesn't have the same overriding power with courts as an Australian Prime Minister would have. So it's interesting that New Zealand is willing to make this move because they see the benefits, even though personally I think the value in doing so in Australia is a fair bit stronger than it is in New Zealand.
Do you think that process whereby you've got the inquiry, it recommends, then you introduce legislation subject to a referendum, do you think that would help build the case for passing, for bipartisan or multi-partisanship, but also passing a referendum?
Absolutely, and that's the reason why
rather than just dropping it, saying we're going to hold a referendum, so it goes through the Parliament, it goes through process. Yeah,
I think this is one of those issues where the public is never going to come to Parliament on, because it's this invisible hidden costs on our economy. If you ask people about it, they're frustrated with the current system. They recognise its limitations, but there's always something more important, and there's always been something more important for over 100 years now. And what New Zealand has shown is that parliamentary inquiry process, once people knew it was multi-partisan, once people understood the topic, it started to be talked about, that's what really got the momentum going. And that's why this committee is so important, because I think it can play that exact same role. Without political leadership, we'll just keep muddling on. But what's been shown in New Zealand and other places, that if you start the conversation and show that political leadership, the public support this and are willing to come along that journey. And I think the thing that we should really take advantage of is the fact that we can legislate this, bed down a model, and we can have a referendum on the status quo rather than a referendum on change, which is a huge advantage, I think.
So having a legislative process would help get a referendum over the line. If it passes both houses, if it's not unanimous, but if it's got strong multi-partisan support, if it gets through the House and Senate, then it's more likely to get through a referendum.
Absolutely. And, the constitutional professors will tell you, well, a Prime Minister could still override that legislation should they wish to, and they absolutely could, but at what political cost? The political cost of doing that would be higher than the benefit of calling an early election at a week that might suit them slightly better. So you've got a pretty good system in place. You show the public that works, you show the model makes sense. The business and the public service community will be so relieved to have that greater confidence to invest and make decisions, and the public will come on board through that process.
I think at the last JSCEM, this is my last question, by the way, at the last JSCEM, it wasn't a bipartisan recommendation to go to 4-year terms because of the 8-year provision in the Senate. My understanding is that that's probably the easier constitutional change if you just change it to 4 years without realigning the Senate. So you just kind of extend it and therefore extend the Senate term. However, I think my understanding was the commentary around the 8 years wasn't necessarily that it was 8 years for the senator. It's in the occasions where, and we heard it from Mr. Bonham earlier, where someone leaves a political party and just sort of becomes a rogue for 7 years, right? Would you support provisions to address that through a constitutional change, that if someone were elected on a party ticket and if they were to leave the party, that the party could then replace them rather than them sitting in the Senate for 7 years non-aligned, noting that the majority of Australians vote above the line and elect that group. And I think in the Senate now we've got disaffected members from all political stripes occupying seats that were they didn't personally achieve.
It's a really great question, and I think one of the biggest concerns that consistently has been with extending Senate terms is exactly that issue. There's obviously the issue about accountability. Even if they stay in the same party, 8 years is a long time as to whether or not that still reflects the will of the people. That's obviously increased substantially if that person leaves that party and goes to another or an independent. Personally, I haven't looked into the details around what that could look like to basically replace a senator. And it's one of the reasons why I think the focus of this committee and the initial step should be on trying to legislate the fixed term piece, because, that's an area where I think there's probably, hopefully, looking at the previous inquiry on this, it's easier to achieve multi-partisan support and maybe even, support from senators in both House of Representatives, because it's not something that affects one house over the other. So if you can make that the focus, I think, of this inquiry and get that locked into bed and make that the focus, then you can avoid muddling the fixed issue with the 4-year terms issue. Because I think as soon as you start doing that and you start raising questions about the Senate and what that should look like, it becomes a much harder sell for the Australian public. And once we have fixed terms in place, then I think we should probably open up the debate about what would a good model for 4-year terms look like, including, how do you deal with the Senate?
And even though a 3-year fixed term, that's what you mean by legislating fixed terms first, right?
Yes, sorry, that's correct, yes.
Yeah, that's only 5 months. You still think that'd have, based on your average 2 years and 7 months, going to 3 years, would extend a term by 5. You think that would have materially positive benefits as outlined for 4-year fixed terms?
I definitely agree. So I think fixed 4-year terms is the gold standard best model I think we should go with. The second best model would, I think, be fixed 3-year terms, because although you get an extra 3-4 months of performance within government, but what you remove is so much of the indecision and uncertainty in the public service and in the private sector, and that's a really hidden cost that occurs all around the country about decisions not made, and it's really hard to calculate what that cost actually is. So I think if you can remove that and have more stability there consistently, that probably on balance is the more beneficial reform in the short term, and it's the easier one to achieve because you don't have to deal with the issue of the Senate. And reform, I think, especially when you're talking about referendums, it should be incremental. Like, let's pick the low-hanging fruit, let's get that done, and then we can start talking about sort of the longer term of the 4 years.
Cool. That's all from me. Thank you, Mr. Gray. I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, committee.
If you've been asked to provide any additional information, and one thing I would ask you to provide is that polling when you retrieve it. Perhaps you can come back and give us a presentation on the polling if you want to unpack that. But it'll be, if you could provide that at some point. But any other questions you've been asked to provide, please forward it to the Secretary by the 21st of November 2025. You'll be sent a copy of your transcript of your evidence, and we'll have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors. Thanks for your time today and for your efforts.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.